Who's going to pay for the mess? Stakes are high at an Iraq donor conference hosted by neighboring Kuwait. So is the price tag, $88 billion over the long haul, says a World Bank estimate. The pledges seem low at first. Donald Trump sent his Secretary of State. So far, no fresh cash, arguing instead for private investment. Others, too, are wary of throwing good money after bad. In an oil-rich nation whose public services seem fragile and whose leadership corrupt. But what government wouldn't be overwhelmed after, for instance, the flattening of Mosul? To keep the jihadists from returning, it's a real Marshall Plan that's needed to restore the vitality of one of the planet's oldest cities. Who owns the reconstruction of places like Mosul? Who owns the future of Iraq? Note the presence that was signaled of both Iran's foreign minister and Sunni Gulf state rivals at that donor conference. Finally, it's about more than just rebuilding roads, internet, and power lines. How to restore Iraq's public services if you don't have reconciliation and justice to go with it, the kind that can convince Iraqis from the diaspora to return and deal fairly with prisoners of war. Today in the France 24 debate, Iraq, who will pay? Joining us from Baghdad, Ahmed Rushdie, foreign policy advisor for the Speaker of the Iraqi Parliament. From Brussels, Joost Hilterman, Middle East Program Director for International Crisis Group. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And here in the studio, we're joined by documentary filmmaker Paul Moreira. You can catch on VOD in French, The Manufacturing of a Monster, about how ISIS overtook parts of Iraq. Thank you for being with us. And we want to welcome as well a man who chronicled ISIS's occupation anonymously under the blog Mosul Eye. Historian Omar Mohammed has come out into the light. He's here with us in Paris. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. Now, before we talk about the conference in Kuwait, let's take stock of the task at hand. We talked about Mosul, but it's not just that city. Correspondent Simona Fulton takes us to Tikrit, the hometown of Saddam Hussein, first taken over by ISIS in 2014 before its recapture by government forces and mostly Shia-led militias 1 year later.
Over 2 years have passed since Iraqi forces freed the industrial town of Beji from the Islamic State group. Not much has changed since then. The town remains a no-man's land, a field of ruins controlled by different militias. Tired of waiting for government support, some citizens have decided to take reconstruction into their own hands.
Nobody has come here to ask us what we need. I've been here for 1 month and even a month and a half and nobody's come. We don't even have electricity or water.
Like many other people who have fled Beji, Munir's family lives in nearby Tikrit. The capital of Salahuddin province faced far less destruction than some of the neighboring cities. Still, 3 years after liberation, the main hospital has yet to be rebuilt. Riyad is a member of the municipal council. He laments over the state of these facilities, where his own son was born.
These are medical records of a patient. All the information about that patient, their entire medical history, treatments, etc. are contained in this folder. It's like we've gone back to the Middle Ages.
In the absence of government funds, the United Nations plans to renovate the hospital. Billions will be needed to rebuild the rest of Tikrit, but donors are wary of pledging funds to a government known for corruption and mismanagement. Then, there is the unquantifiable cost of the psychological damage suffered by those who lived under the rule of the terror group. This organization helps children displaced by war catch up on years of lost education and to deal with trauma.
The children saw killings, bombardments, people being killed in front of their eyes. These are things they should never have experienced.
The first step in healing the wounds left by this war is to rebuild infrastructure so that families can return home. Few trust the government with this task, and so many have pinned all their hopes on the international community.
And the images in that report, Omar Mohammed, mirror some of the ones on your Facebook page of Mosul Eye. Your reaction to what you saw in that report and the challenges a place like Tikrit and its surrounding towns face.
Tikrit and Mosul and Anbar City, or the three destroyed cities, The destruction wasn't only few buildings. The destruction was about the infrastructure of these cities. These three cities now are without infrastructure, without hospitals, without schools, without universities, without the basic needs.
We saw in the report those two men, one with a wheelbarrow, the other with a shovel. Where do you start?
It's not only in Tikrit, actually. It's probably this guy is lucky that he has this small thing, but there are many others who have nothing to do. They are living in the camps. I mean, for example, from Mosul. Until now, we have more than 2 million refugees living in the camps. They have nothing to do. They have nothing to go back. Their homes, and even if they decided to go back, even their homes have been destroyed. But to go back for what? No hospitals, no medical care, no basic services. So, simply, it's not possible for them to stay.
Joost Hilterman, the liberation of Tikrit happened more than 2 years ago. Could more have been done by now?
Of course. More could have been done, of course. And more should be done, not only in Tikrit, but in all the other places. And I think what we're witnessing is a combination of two things. One is an international disinterest in providing for reconstruction in a serious way in Iraq that would really lead to the revival of what are majority Sunni Arab areas in Iraq. And secondly, a pervasive corruption that makes it very difficult for the Iraqi government to effectively do reconstruction in many areas. A lot of money just simply disappears. And that is maybe the largest challenge of all.
A lot of money disappears, and right now, with the money disappearing, what are the consequences of that beyond the fact that the cities don't get rebuilt?
Well, I mean, it makes for bad governance throughout the country, of course. And I know that Prime Minister Abadi is of a mind to change this, but he faces very serious obstacles because the corruption has been institutionalized. So it basically means that the country itself, as a country, cannot really recover from all the shocks it has sustained in the past 3 or 4 decades. But the situation in the Sunni Arab areas is worse because there you've seen the devastation that you saw in the footage in Tikrit, in Mosul, in Fallujah, in many other smaller towns and villages. And so what you have, as Mr. Omar indicated, is a population that remains displaced and where, in addition, people are going to accumulate their grievances, and you will see further or renewal of radicalization and maybe the resurgence of some kind of insurgency in these areas in the long term.
All right, among those in attendance at that donor conference, and let's turn our attention to it, the one that's taking place in neighboring Kuwait, is the French foreign minister. He has Jean-Yves Le Drian, who has first gone to visit Baghdad and Erbil. He talks of the need to do more than just rebuild.
Will only sustainably recover if it brings together reconstruction, stabilization, and national reconciliation. These three processes are linked. And material reconstruction will also, therefore, have to take into account the human and social dimensions, which is why France will be particularly attentive to the inclusiveness of the construction efforts, which should not leave aside any region or community.
The inclusiveness of the reconstruction effort, getting everybody on board, not just making it Shias or Sunnis, but everybody or all the other minority groups inside of Iraq. Paul Moreira, sources telling our Arab language colleagues, though, that among the donors, Sunni nations who want to give money just for Sunni areas. What are your thoughts on this conference taking place in Kuwait?
First, I mean, it seems so incredible that I would need to confirm that, but from what I understood, the United States are not planning to give any money for the reconstruction of Iraqi towns, which I find totally surreal because I mean I remember in 2003 when I mean I was in Baghdad when in April when Baghdad fell, and basically it was like history has been on repeat mode since then, because I mean these images I've seen them 15 years ago, and with the same claims, people needing. My first two words in Iraqi were karaba and mai, which means electricity and water. And 15 years after, I see the same people cleaning, sweeping the same streets with the same debris, with the same books on the floor, and the same libraries being destroyed. It's like repeating and repeating and repeating for 15 years. And we must remember that all of that, after an intervention looking for non-existent weapons of mass destruction. I think there's an historical responsibility from the United States on this one, and they really would need to be on the forefront of people helping rebuilding Iraq.
All right, lots of players present in Kuwait, including the U.S. Secretary of State, who's pledged his country's commitment to stamping out what remains of ISIS and to bolstering security in Iraq as well as in neighboring Syria. Rex Tillerson's words, though, following a tweet on Monday by his boss promoting a U.S. federal budget plan that aims to spend big on domestic infrastructure. Here's what Donald Trump tweeted. This will be a big week for infrastructure after so stupidly spending $7 trillion. He says in the Middle East, it is now time to start investing in our country. By the way, the $7 trillion is overblown, say experts.
Yeah, sure.
But what was your reaction when you saw that?
I'm shocked. I mean, we must understand. I've been following this area of the planet for the last 15 years, and we have just created a monster. That was the topic of the documentary I done you're mentioning, that is going to strike back over and over again. I mean, it's a matter of even security, our own security as Western countries, to be able to help the Iraqi people rebuild their country. It's massively in our interest, and seeing some expression of such selfishness is worrisome, because he is supposed to be the leader of the free world. So you better wake up and understand that if we do nothing to help this area of the planet, meaning Iraq and Syria, there will be dragons. We will be seeing a lot of bad stuff happening to us, because we know that when you forget countries like that in a shambles, what breeds is really ugly, usually.
When Donald Trump tweets something like that, do Iraqis say, well, that's Trump, that's not all of the United States?
Yeah. I mean, whether Trump is serious or it's just a tweet, we don't know. I mean, we don't understand Trump anymore. But what he said is really true. I mean, why should the United States pay more money to Iraq while they were paying since 2003 for 15 years? And look what's happening in Iraq now. 3 destroyed cities with thousands of militias, with millions of displaced people. Why should they pay? And yes, there is hope with this conference in Kuwait, but not to repeat the same mistake. As I always said, if we want to really make a solution, a good solution in Iraq, this should be under international observation. And this conference, or the donors, or the companies that are willing to invest in Iraq, it should be under international observation directly, not through the Iraqi government.
Hughes Tilterman, Donald Trump is touting the idea that there should be more private sector investment, that's the best way that you'll fix Iraq's broken infrastructure. Do you agree?
Well, first of all, I think that reconstruction has to happen by Iraqi hands in the first place. Iraqis themselves know what the needs are and how they should be executed. And if you look at the $88 billion budget that or sum that the Iraqi government has set as a goal for reconstruction, it intends to pay most of that itself. So it is not counting on external sources for the majority of these funds. But obviously what comes from the outside should be a mix of state support and private support. But the important thing is that governments provide guarantees so that when private investments fail, for example, businesses will feel protected. That will allow a greater number of businesses to take the risk, the gamble, of investing in a reconstruction in a country as uncertain as Iraq. So it has to be in combination. And I just want to note that in the day, the pledging is tomorrow, so we don't really know yet who's going to pledge what. But already yesterday, Kuwaiti NGOs pledged a total of $330 million. That's just Kuwaiti NGOs, and that's remarkable, and we should recognize that, and we should at least be hopeful that this kind of gesture is met by Western governments and regional governments. On your issue of inclusion, I just want to say it is very important that the aid that is given be colorblind. To the extent that it is channeled through the United Nations, international agencies and NGOs, and that it not favor one group over another. You mentioned that the Gulf states may be supporting only Sunni projects, Sunni cities, but the problem is also that some Western governments are channeling their aid only to Christian villages and Christian areas. Both of that is wrong. Aid should be colorblind, and it should go to all the areas that are most deserving, simply on the degree of their destruction.
On the degree of their destruction, Paul Moreira, is that possible today? And of course, this conference is taking place in the context of the build-up to a general election that's happening in May in Iraq.
Mm. Well, I think that, unfortunately, there has been a sectarian war in Iraq for many, many years, and cities that were before mixed Sunnis and Shia living together have been slightly divided. I mean, or heavily divided after the sectarian conflict. I'm thinking like Fallujah. There's probably not much more Shias living in Fallujah. I don't know about Mosul. It's a huge town, so there's probably still a lot of Shia living there. But you end up, when you're rebuilding towns, the towns that need to be rebuilt now, most of them are Sunnis. So I don't know if it's a topic. You just need to rebuild the towns that have been destroyed. So they happen to be Sunni.
What the situation is in Mosul, I'm going to ask you when we come back from the break, and what Mosul needs, Iraq's second city. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
Revisited, presented by Stuart Norval.
On June the 5th, 1967, the Israeli army invaded Egyptian Sinai, unleashing a war that would change the face of the Middle East. During the Six-Day War, Israel took rapid possession of the Golan Heights, the West Bank and the Old City of Jerusalem, holy sites for Jews, Muslims and Christians alike. It's a stranglehold that the Israeli authorities have maintained to this day.
The Temple Mount and the Western Wall will forever remain under Israeli sovereignty.
50 years later, East Jerusalem still symbolizes the ascendancy of Israel, whose settlements policy has created tensions which are as strong today as ever and make the atmosphere in Jerusalem unique in the world.
Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.
France in Focus, presented by Tom Burgess-Watson.
Every year, millions of people head to French mountain resorts for some of the best skiing in the world. In this week's edition of France in Focus, we're in the Trois Vallées in the French Alps, where we examine the environmental impacts of all these visitors and what's being done to make mountain tourism more sustainable.
France in Focus on France 24 and France24.com.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France 24 debate, some of the stories Laura Cellier is following for you in the newsroom. Breaking news out of South Africa. Jacob Zuma is to hold a media briefing at 10 a.m. local time Wednesday. That's according to one television station. This after the African National Congress ordered South Africa's president of 9 years to step down as head of state. Zuma's spokesperson not yet confirming that he will be responding to that order to stand down. A UK appeals court rejects Julian Assange's call to have bail-jumping charges dropped. The WikiLeaks founder to remain inside the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Near Paris, the opening of the trial of a then 28-year-old teacher accused over a sexual relationship with an 11-year-old pupil. Lawyers want the case branded as the charge branded as rape. The government now considering whether to establish an age of consent in France. 17-year-old Chloe Kim steals the show in Pyeongchang, winning half-pipe gold for the United States, while Austria's Marcel Hirscher shows why he's the world's best men's skier, winning the Olympic combined ahead of two Frenchmen. Ketevan Gorgistani will have all the day's sports news. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're discussing the plan for rebuilding cities and towns and areas in Iraq that were destroyed during the fight to oust Islamic State militants. That conference taking place in neighboring Kuwait. With us to talk about it from Brussels, Joost Hilterman, Middle East Program Director for International Crisis Group. Paul Moreira, founder of Première Ligne television documentary filmmaker. And we also want to welcome back Omar Mohammed, who has chronicled ISIS's occupation under the blog Mosul Eye. Now, it's quite amazing. You took great risks by chronicling what life was like under ISIS, and you escaped through Syria carrying with you a hard drive,
the small book,
and in that, what did you have inside of that hard drive?
The daily events of the city under ISIS, with videos, pictures, names, documents, everything about, I would say, the whole history of the city under ISIS. Yeah.
And your feeling when they first took over the city, at that point in time, what was the mood like in Mosul?
Well, in the beginning, the people didn't recognize that this is ISIS. They didn't know. The people felt like they are now revealed that the city has no more the corrupted government. But they didn't recognize, they didn't realize that this is ISIS. So after a few days, when ISIS revealed its true face, no, things was changed and the people were shocked.
So it only took a few days for the population to turn against ISIS.
Just a few days.
This is, we were talking just before the break about how you had, communities that were mixed before 2003, which have become ethnically cleansed of one or the other. Mosul, one of the oldest cities in the world, and it has an historic town center. It's got the river that runs through it. Those rich and ethnically mixed or sectarian mixed neighborhoods, is that over for good? This will be a different Mosul henceforth?
Unfortunately, the city is different now. We used to have a unique coexistence in the city, where if you take a look at the history of this city, you will see that all the minorities have lived there, in around Sinjar, the Nineveh Plains, inside Mosul itself. We have 13 churches in this city, the only city in Iraq that has this amount of, this number of churches. But I'm afraid that after what happened, after 2014, after the destruction of the city, I'm afraid that we will not be able to go back to Mosul, or Mosul will ever be back to that unique coexistence.
We heard the statement from the French foreign minister prodding the Iraqis to say, hey, you can't rebuild if you don't have reconciliation.
Yeah.
What's happening at the local level in Mosul? Are local elders or officials taking matters into their own hands and trying to have some kind of forum where there can be a reconciliation?
Well, there is something amazing happening in the city since the end of the battle to retake the city. It's a growing youth movement. They are working on this kind of reconciliation, on cultural stuff, rebuilding the city. I mean, one of the amazing events that happened in the city was young Muslim people cleaned and prepared the church St. Paul, and prepared for the Christian to hold the Christmas. This was a unique moment in the city, which means that there is hope, but they need to be supported, and it's now to support them. It's now to focus on the youth more, and to take them out from the hands of ISIS or the other groups that are only working to weaponize and militarize the young people.
So there is a youth movement. Paul Moreira, your experience, you weren't in Mosul last year, but in other parts that had been...
Baghdad.
Are there these kinds of initiatives?
Yes, absolutely. And that's something that stays under the radar. But I went... actually, story of the documentary I was doing is to go back and meet a guy I had filmed in 2004. So to meet him 12 years after, and to have his impression about, how did he get into what we know today. And he was a member of the militia called the Mahdi Army. There's this Shia militia from Sadr City. They were quite radical, nationalists.
Sadr City, which is a neighborhood of Baghdad.
100% Shia. And, he gained a bit of weight. 12 years have passed by, and he said, you have to come to the Friday demonstration. They call it the Iraqi Spring movement. And he brought me to this Tahrir place, Tahrir Square, where I saw something very, that put me in a very good humor, because I saw young people, I saw women without scarves that were from the left parties, I saw secular parties, I saw the guys from the Muqtada al-Sadr party, the Mahdi Army party, and they were demonstrating together, and I think now they run a coalition for the next election, so that you have a coalition of what was once one of the fiercest militias that was really a dangerous militia, now doing a coalition with communist and left-leaning parties, and they're going to election together. And physically, it's something unseen to have these young people, women without any women who are Christian or even atheists, like claiming to be atheists, demonstrating with religious people, and that was something very unseen for me.
But forgive me for asking is this just, a small group of people in a country that's run on patronage politics?
Yeah, just one thing regarding the Muqtada al-Sadr. He's the only religious man who recently allied with seculars, which means that there is a new way in Iraq to do the political stuff, to work alongside with what they call them. I mean, the Mahdi militia was one of the most militias that were involved in the sectarian war in Iraq. But now it's different. And I was referring to the youth movement in the aftermath, after the liberation of Mosul. It's really different and unique. I mean, we have seen people coming from southern Iraq to Mosul to support the people of Mosul. And we have seen people from Mosul going to southern Iraq to thank them for the liberation of the city. This couldn't be happened before 2014. There are many chances now. They have opportunities. It's difficult, yes. The social structure have been damaged, badly damaged, but there is a possibility to rebuild it again.
And they want it, That's what's so striking.
All right, let me ask you, Joost Hilterman, on this point. Joost, this is what, there is this movement that's being described. Another scenario that's being described in the upcoming May elections is the return of Nouri al-Maliki, who is a polarizing figure inside of Iraq. How do you convince those inside of the diaspora in Iraq, those who've been away since 2003, not just civil servants, but engineers, doctors, to return? All right, we seem to be having a sound issue. Sorry for that, Yus Tilterman. A sound issue with Brussels. We'll try to have that fixed as soon as possible. I want to welcome at this point in time Ahmed Rushdi, foreign policy advisor to the Speaker of the Iraqi Parliament. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate. The question we've been asking at this point in time, Ahmed Rushdi, is about at this point in time whether or not Iraqis can rebuild if they haven't gone through with reconciliation. All right, we're having a problem there too with Baghdad. We'll try to have that fixed as well. How do you convince those from the diaspora? By the way, personal question here, Omar Mohammed, is your plan to go back to Mosul?
Yes.
And many Iraqis, I suspect, don't share that plan at this point in time.
Of course, I mean, but it's my city, and it's my obligation to go back, also to encourage and to involve with this youth movement I just described. We have an opportunity now. We have to take it seriously. The prospects so up in the air.
Another question that's been asked is, and gets us back to that tweet that we mentioned by Donald Trump about the United States prefers to spend on Americans. A lot of people asking why the Iraqis aren't spending more, or rather, where's the money right now? Yeah. Because oil exports are booming in Iraq. Exports from the southern terminal of Basra have most notably been going up and up and up, making Iraq's OPEC's second biggest producer. Statistics from Bloomberg talk of 3.7 million barrels a day at the end of last December. After hitting a peak there in November, most of that's in red. It comes out of Basra. The rest comes out of other places. Paul Moreira, where's that oil revenue?
If I knew. No, but that's something that is really surprising when you go to Baghdad nowadays, is the amount of luxury cars that you see, the amount of wealth of hotels that obviously are occupied by businessmen. And so there's a part of the country that is very thriving in terms of business. And then there's the other part. And I think that's the core issue about Iraq nowadays, is that they have to share the wealth more thoroughly. Because when I go back to the Shia neighborhoods, the poor Shia neighborhoods, they have the same problems. The electricity is running on and out, on and off. The water is semi-clean. And so basically 15 years after, they still need to fix the basic infrastructures. And if they don't do that, they'll keep on having on breeding problems later, because people are so angry that all those years after, nobody, neither the Western countries or their government, have been able to fix the basic infrastructure of a country.
Omar Mohammed, how do you explain it? Where is that money?
I mean, we have to admit, it's not about sectarianism, it's not about religion in Iraq. It's the corruption within the government. It's unbelievable corruption. Everything is corrupted. And that's why we say that we feel there is hope with the Kuwait conference. But still, we don't know if this money is going to the hand of this corrupted government. Are they going to give the money to the government, and the government will do the same thing, and we will lose the same money again? It's the corruption. This is what we are asking. I always talk about this. I talked about this with the European Parliament. We need more international observation to help Iraq to stop, I don't want to be much optimistic about this, to end the corruption, but to limit the corruption at least. So to give the other people the chance to work. It's the corruption what makes Iraq like this. It's the corruption what brought ISIS.
The corruption that brought ISIS, you're saying, and yeah, the the amounts of money are stupendous. That we don't really know where they're going. And we heard Joost Hilterman saying that he'd like to see international aid groups actually channel the money directly. Would Iraqis agree to that?
I'm not sure that, but what happened today and yesterday in the Kuwait conference, I heard that the Iraqi government have somehow approved and agreed with the international organizations to make them work in Iraq without going through the Iraqi government, or to give them their space. I hope this will happen. I'm not sure, but is the only solution.
All right, among those arriving at this conference, the foreign minister of Iran, Mohammad Javad Zarif, landing, saying his country would stand by the Iraqi people together. We have confirmation that he's there. He's at the same conference as the U.S. Secretary of State, Paul Moreira. What can this Kuwait conference achieve in that respect?
Well, about the Iranian presence, I mean, it would have been very, very surprising that if the Iranians wouldn't been at this conference, because basically they have a hand on the country. I mean, they control. We all know that they control the Interior Ministry. They have a lot of influence in the country. Maybe a little bit, a bit less now. But I remember that when the Americans were still in the country, there was an Iranian joke saying, if the U.S. or Israel want to bomb us, we don't care because we have 140,000 hostages. Speaking about the American soldiers on the ground in Iraq, and basically that the influence of Iran is difficult even to imagine. It's very pervasive and very efficient. So of course they're going to be at this conference, and I presume that they will sign some checks for the rebuilding of Iraq.
Was it a good news or a bad news story, the fact that Iran is there?
It's a reality. They are in Iraq, therefore they are part of the diplomatic game. I mean, it would be very strange that it wouldn't come to this conference.
And you have as well the fact that it's being hosted by Kuwait, the country that Saddam Hussein overran in 1990. What does that tell you as well? Why did Kuwait want so badly to be the host of this?
This is a serious test for Iraq. And this is a good message from Kuwait, which is the Gulf, that we want to work with Iraq. And if Iraq succeeded in this test, I think we will get closer to the Arabic Gulf, and Iran still has its influence on Iraq, but in Iraq, I see there is a new situation. Iraq is working to get more trust from the regional countries, from the United States, and from the international community. So this conference is not only about donors, it's not only about investments, but also it's a test to test if Iraq is able to work again with their conditions.
A unique window of opportunity, the fact that you have all these countries together and they're around the same table?
In Kuwait. It's a unique opportunity.
In Kuwait, Paul Moreira.
Yeah, it seems odd when we remember 91 and Kuwait was invaded and it was the beginning of the first Gulf War, to think that it happens in Kuwait now. But again, I mean, I'm still surprised that it doesn't trigger much of an outcry, the fact that the U.S. are clearly stating, or at least Mr. Trump, that happens to be the president of the United States, is clearly stating that he will try as much as possible not to put a dime into an operation into rebuilding Iraq. I mean, it seems very strange and odd to me. I mean, we disagree on that.
One final question on this, which is the French foreign minister, while in Baghdad, saying it's okay to try French jihadists who are being held.
Yeah.
But please don't impose the death penalty on two alleged female radicals, who are in Iraqi custody right now. Your thoughts on the way France and other nations are handling their foreign fighters who are being held captive in Iraq?
Well, in terms of international law, it makes sense. I mean, they committed crimes in Iraq and Syria, and they should be judged where they committed their crimes. And obviously, from a military point of view, it's going to solve a lot of problems because we all know that Iraqi and in Iraq they're going to be subject to the death penalty. I don't know about the two ladies. I don't know their responsibilities, but obviously that's going to solve a military problem as well as a political problem.
For the French.
They're going to get rid of a lot of guys who are in the hands of the Iraqi army now.
Over the past few days, Omar Mohammed, and again, you were subject to this firsthand, to the occupation of ISIS in Mosul. There's been a lot of media coverage over the capture of and what to do about two of the remaining so-called Beatles, this group of jihadists who held foreigners captive and videotaped the beheadings. What are your thoughts on the way that their fate is being handled?
Well, there's still a problem to deal with this, with the ISIS fighters, whether they are foreigners or locals from Iraq. In my opinion, the only solution is to bring them to justice, to International Court of Justice, to consider them as criminals, committed crimes. They should be judged according to this.
To The Hague?
Yeah. If the European countries, if they don't want to bring back their fighters, they should be judged according to the Iraqi law. Or to make the right solution is to make it like an international law, to consider all the ISIS fighters, whether they are locals or foreigners, and to bring them to justice.
Omar Mohammed, I want to thank you. I want to remind people that your blog is called Mosul Eye. Thank you for joining us. I also want to thank as well Paul Moreira. Your documentary is called The Making, what is it? Fabrication of a Monster. And I want to thank as well Joost Hilterman of International Crisis Group in Brussels and Ahmed Rushdie, advisor to the Speaker of Parliament. Apologies for the technical issues we were having off-set. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Creedon, who's bringing us Diplo tweets.
Well,
what are Diplo tweets?
Kuwait conference wouldn't be the buzziest story of the day, but a lot of people obviously at the conference.
The hashtag's not trending.
The hashtag isn't trending, apart from people who were probably at the conference or interested in it, which should be probably more than there is. Anyway, I'll just show you some of what's coming up online.
Right.
A lot of people taking advantage of the conference to draw attention to the need for investments in Mosul in particular. Hundreds of civilians have lost their homes and need your help in the city of Mosul. Also, images such as this. When you're traveling to the west side of Mosul, all you can see is this, destroyed buildings. And this is another image of the same nature showing the devastation in Mosul and, of course, the absolute urgency of investment and resources getting to that city with the hashtags Mosul Reconstruction and Rebuild Iraq. So certainly the conversation is happening amongst people who are checking in and seeing that. Obviously politicians and political groups who are at the conference putting their own particular spin on it. I won't go there because it would take too long to unpack all of that, but taking a look at some of the aid organisations. UNICEF at the Kuwait Conference for Reconstruction in Iraq, UNICEF and UN Habitat are appealing for firm commitments to restore basic infrastructure and services for children. You can see there that the hashtag that's being pushed is Rebuild Iraq. Also, some stories of individuals who have been affected by the devastation. The hospital is abandoned and destroyed. Health workers are doing their best, but they are struggling. That is the testimony of Hamid speaking also to UNICEF. Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, also tweeting about the urgency of money getting to the health sector and the need to rebuild hospitals. The International Committee for the Red Cross, again, the same sort of images, just really trying to put the spotlight on the human suffering and the consequences of the prolonged conflict and the aftermath of the conflict. Just one further piece of information that I thought was worth pointing to. The US Institute of Peace, they have an interview on their website which they tweeted. and they say to stabilise Iraq after ISIS, help Iraqis reconcile amongst themselves. And what is less emphasised, they say here, and this is a quote from Nancy Lindborg, who is the president of the US IP, what is less emphasised is the need to rebuild the devastated social fabric. This includes restoring the shattered trust within and amongst various communities as well as with the governments. And so there's quite an emphasis on that article on that aspect of things, the deep societal wounds that if left unaddressed could generate another round of extremism and sectarian violence.
James Creedon, many thanks for that. And of course, we'll be following that last day of the conference. I want to thank our panel. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.